Welcome to Conversations in Eating Recovery. In our third episode, we're diving into the GLP-1 media frenzy and its potential risks for individuals with eating disorders or those in recovery. I'm Alison Ross, founder and clinical director of NDH Therapy, and I'm joined by two incredible therapists from our team, Lindsay Hall and Sydney Hafer. And today, for us, it's personal because recently something happened to Sydney at her doctor's office that actually really hit us all in the gut. During her appointment, her doctor offered to prescribe Ozempic without asking her about her mental health or eating disorder history. And as three people who've recovered from eating disorders, this incident was upsetting as it could have posed a threat to Sydney's recovery. We needed to talk about it here. So every day, we're all bombarded by the weight loss shot media frenzy. Ads on TV, miracle shot stories on social media, Groupon deals, offers at medical spas, and even knockoff products at Target all send that same message. Thinner is better, and these meds are the answer to health and happiness. But if you've ever struggled with an eating disorder, as we did, or you're in recovery, those messages can be really problematic. They can poke at old wounds, it can stir up dangerous mindsets, and they can threaten to worsen or pull you back into disordered eating patterns. So today, we want to talk about what happened to Sydney and the impact these medications and their hype are having on people with eating disorder tendencies. So Sydney, you want to start by telling our audience what happened to you?
Alrighty, so I go to the gynecologist every few months because I have PCOS, to get kind of like routine lab work, see how my medications are going, and to make sure everything is being monitored okay so that I am feeling my best. Just recently, when I was at the doctor, she asked me kind of what symptoms I was having, what had been coming up for me, how I'd been feeling. We went over kind of like the efficacy of the medication that I'm on or how I feel like it's working. And I had shared with her some frustration with the fact that it felt like my sugar cravings were a little bit higher, kind of like they were when I first started treatment with her. And she was like, well, we could talk about Ozempic for you. And I kind of like was like, oh, like, wow, that's interesting. I was like, yeah, it's like not something I'm really interested in. And she kind of kept poking and was like, well, do you know if your weight has gone up since the last time I saw you? And I was like, no. I kind of explained to her, like, I feel like I do every time I'm there. Like, no, I don't weigh myself. I had a history of, like, I had an eating disorder for a really long time. Like, not something I'm like overly hyper focused on. If I have gained weight, it's not the end of the world. Like, that's not the primary thing of the whole picture that I'm like utterly concerned with. And I think the thing that felt most unsettling about the entire situation to me was that she kind of like was pushing back and was like, well, your weight is like not being managed right now. And I was like, I understand my weight is not being managed. Like, that's not the main reason that I'm here, what I'm looking for from you. And she kind of kept making comments that it was like my health was being unmanaged by what we were doing without knowing if my weight had changed, without running a new set of labs and to look at if my labs were off or different than anything I had experienced the last time I was there. And based on how my treatment for my PCOS has looked thus far, there's a lot of different areas we're targeting that are much more concerning to me rather than the number on the scale. And kind of like Allison said, I think it had like me going on a GLP-1 would have had the potential to completely backslide all of the progress that I've made in my recovery. And that was like her gut reaction based on without asking further questions, kind of talking about what my goals were, what I was looking for out of my appointment for the day. It automatically was like, your weight's not being managed properly. And I was like, that's not what I'm looking for in my medical care. And it was just like deeply unsettling. And when all three of us had a conversation about it, we all were kind of like, oh my goodness, thank God that I am in a really solid place in my recovery. And I am an eating disorder therapist who is very well versed in kind of things like this happening and what to do in the situation that like you get faced with a medical provider saying that to you. But I think so often it can feel really scary to stand up for yourself in medical settings and to kind of challenge what is being recommended to you. And I think if you're struggling or having a hard time in your recovery, something like that being offered to you so simply can feel really enticing. It can kind of be the end of something that you've been working so hard for.
And I'm just curious, like, what was she meaning about your weights not being managed?
I don't know. And I was kind of thinking about that after had left there, because not a single time that I have been seeing this doctor for, I've had my PCOS diagnosis and been being treated for it for about 8 months now. And like my weight, no one has taken my weight a single time that I have gone to the doctor's office, and like throughout the entire trajectory of my care. So I'm like, we don't even know if I have gained weight. Like maybe I have, but like not, we don't have any numerical data to support that, because that's not something we've been tracking. So and like when I hear unmanaged, my brain perceives that as weight gain, which like probably is incorrect in itself. But that was very confusing to me, because I was like, on what grounds to stand are we saying that my weight is unmanaged? Because we don't really have any evidence pointing to that fact.
Yeah.
It just makes me think about, well, one, how sad I am that you had that experience, and two, the gap in knowledge between medical providers and mental health providers. And I know that there could be a relationship between disordered eating and PCOS, and it just makes me really sad that there's a gap in profession, and like
Yeah.
about that at a larger systemic scale.
Yeah, because I mean, I know, like, I know your doctor was just like trying to help you, and that she would never want to like help you relapse into your eating disorder. But I can imagine how going on a medication like that to manage your weight, what a slippery slope that could be for somebody with an eating disorder history, right? And I think, to Lindsay's point, a lot of times doctors aren't really educated on eating disorders. And so they might be thinking, okay, well, we could help this one thing over here, but not really thinking about what the impact of that might be on somebody who has internalized a lot of meaning around like their weight and ties their weight to worth. And I'm not saying that you do anymore, Sydney, but you had a history of that I think could have been stirred back up by an interaction like that. And that maybe you guys, like I do, see this a lot in the therapy room, where people who are struggling to recover from an eating disorder go to the doctor and get weighed and get the Ozempic talk or get the weight really focused in on. And they're trying so hard to overcome that over focus on weight and that over exaggerated importance that a person with an eating disorder puts on what they weigh. So that whole thing, I think, could have got stirred up in that conversation for you, or for one of our clients, or for lots of people.
Well, and I think what can be so challenging is when someone is actively in the midst of struggling with their eating disorder. I think so often, I remember this with myself and see it all the time with my clients, but like people are constantly seeking evidence for what they already believe. So if you already believe that your weight is not what it should be and that you need to change it or do something about it because you're in the midst of struggling with your disorder, then you get feedback from a medical provider who is supposed to like have all the knowledge and be the one to point you in the right direction of what to do, that you need to change your weight by using a GLP-1, that's very confusing and could feel very disorienting. And I think that is what's so scary about it, is I think so often that if any of my clients were to have been in that position, it could have potentially been extremely harmful.
Yeah. Like, what could happen if you, as somebody who has a history of a very restrictive part of your eating, you had a very restrictive eating disorder. If anybody watched our last two podcasts, you'll hear a little bit about Sydney's eating disorder and how it started as just kind of like a simple little diet to like look better, feel better, be a little healthier. And then it just went to the extreme. And so I'm just sitting here thinking, like, what if you took that Ozempic from the doctor? What if you accepted that? Where could that go, do you think, for you as somebody with that history?
Yeah, I mean, I think like if that was a decision that I would have ultimately ended up making, I think it would have had the potential to disrupt every area of my life. I think there is a chance that I would not be able to be here sitting having conversations like this, because if I was in my eating disorder, I would not feel comfortable talking about treating, doing anything in relation to eating disorders, or necessarily being a therapist. I don't think I could be in a healthy relationship with my partner. I when I was super deep in my eating disorder, couldn't maintain a job, couldn't pay rent, I was so unable to do anything besides be entrenched in my own brain and my relationship with food and movement and how to like restrict those. That I think it would have destabilized every area of my life. Maybe not right off the bat, but eventually.
You know what I'm thinking about as you're talking? I'm thinking about a friend of mine who had some years sober before she met the person that she would marry. And like they were out on dates, and her boyfriend at the time said to her, I wish that we could just like have one drink together. Like, couldn't we just like have one drink? It would be so fun. And her response to him was, you better hope you never see me take a drink, because our lives could be absolutely demolished by that. And I was like, that is a great answer. And, as somebody who's recovered from an eating disorder, I won't do crash dieting ever again. And when I'm working with somebody who's recovering from an eating disorder that has a restrictive side to it, and that could be a lot of eating disorders, perhaps most, that could be anorexia, that could be yo-yo dieting, that could be chronic dieting, that could be a restricting emotional eating cycle or a restricting binging cycle, because most of the eating disorders that have I can't stop eating out of control type of component to them have also a restrictive component that is setting that off and perpetuating that, right? But as somebody who myself had a restrictive quality to my restricting and binge eating, I will never go on another crash diet, because I know that that restarts my eating disorder cycle. It would be, for me, someone giving me Ozempic would be like giving a recovered alcoholic a drink.
Yeah, it's something that is, at least for me, like too much of a gamble that I'm not willing to take, because I don't know how the outcome is going to be.
It makes me think about larger scale, but like what we're seeing a lot in the news is the rise of food insecurity. We have more access to Ozempic and GL1 modified products than we do to food nowadays, especially for people who are financially disadvantaged or who need the EBT or the SNAP benefits. Maybe won't have access to that anymore, but you can go to Target, Costco, CVS, Groupon, and get something that manipulates your weight, your relationship with food so much easier. And to me, that's heartbreaking. Like, how are we going to have more access to something that makes us lose weight than access to like healthy, nourishing foods?
Yeah, it speaks to a really, really heartbreaking part of our society and what our food and diet culture are and what they create for people and what we have to like be resilient against in order to be healthy. We shouldn't have to be resilient against our food culture, big pharma, diet culture to be able to be healthy, but we do need to be. I think about how like sometimes if I'm working with somebody with an eating disorder that has a restrictive side to it and they have a really bad stomach flu, I get worried because I know that if they can't eat for a while, that old pattern that used to feel so good to them of like restricting food, not eating, can like show up in their bodies again. And they can really like it, unfortunately, because unfortunately that restrictive side of an eating disorder is the one that gets really praised in diet culture and the one that people feel really good when they're in. It never really happens on its own. I mean, it usually sets off all the other stuff, right? But that really worries me. And so I feel the same way when people are able to get such access to these medications, because like all of us have been offered them. I don't think any of us would benefit from them. Could we lose a little weight? Could our labs change a little bit in a positive direction if we went on Ozempic? Maybe in the beginning. Would it be worth the risk that we would potentially like restart a yo-yo dieting cycle, or that we would like get out of touch with our hunger and our fullness and our appetite cues? Because that to me is such an important part of recovery that I would have missed. Like if I were recovering right now, I would probably find a way to get my hands on those medications. And I don't think it would be hard.
Well, and I think it poses the larger question as well, kind of what you said, Allison, of like, is there a chance that it could be somewhat beneficial for all of us at the beginning, potentially. I don't necessarily know all of our like medical histories super in depth. I know that for PCOS, it is sometimes used because of insulin resistance.
Yeah.
Also, what's a little bit more unhealthy, me struggling with a little bit of insulin resistance and having sugar cravings, or me being in like dire malnourishment because I'm taking a weight loss drug that suppresses my appetite and I'm no longer fueling myself appropriately. Like that in itself is very, very harmful. And I think that's a part of the conversation that people are not necessarily talking about, is like medically induced starvation is still your body being malnourished.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's, that a lot of people say things like that to me, like, but my insulin resistance, or, my, my weight, my blood pressure, my cholesterol, all the things, like, cause like we do hear a lot of things, and it's true. Like, oh yeah, I went on Ozempic and like my labs are just so much better. And that's wonderful. We want that for people, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily sustainable. And it doesn't mean that it's necessarily not going to have other really big risks or negative consequences. But one of the things that I worry about with that is that, like, yes, these medications can have some benefits for people. But at the same time, there are really big risks that people are taking by having them. And there are so many tools that we have to work with things like insulin resistance and to work with things like sugar cravings, right? There are a lot of tools that we have, and it sort of feels like to me that for most people, it would be beneficial to start with the natural things, to start with, like, maybe even like hearing the voice of your sugar cravings, because that's a voice. Your body is speaking in those sugar cravings. And, maybe it's kind of covering some deeper needs. Maybe there's a little stress, maybe there's a little emotional stuff that you have been so busy and haven't had time to journal about or think about, right? Because when my body's talking and I'm having sugar cravings or things like that, I'll often wonder, like, what's going on in my life? Am I in balance? Am I, stressed out? Am I in need of something? And I learned that in my recovery. And I feel like that's something I would not have learned if during my recovery, I was able to just grab onto one of these drugs. I wouldn't have learned how to tease out, like, the voice of my hunger. What is emotional hunger? What is physical hunger? What is my food? If I'm having food noise, people say this all the time. Oh, I need these medications because they shut down the food noise. Totally get it. Completely understand. How wonderful to have a shot where you could just shut off your food noise. But where does that go in the long term? Because for me, I needed to listen to that signal. Food noise is a signal. It's saying we're too stressed. It's saying we're not nourished. And for me, what was so good that came from my recovery was being able to read my body and going, oh, there's some, food noise. I need something. I need some emotional care. I need some stress relief. I need to take care of myself a little better.
It makes me wonder too, like, what is the end that people are looking for, right? Because these medications are only a temporary relief. And then what happens after, because like we're not making lifestyle changes. We're not listening to the voice. We're not getting curious about our experience. We're essentially putting a Band-Aid on a deeper, larger experience that deserves to be like looked at and deserves to be coped with. And our relationship with food, from my understanding with Ozempic, it gets completely changed. We lose our hunger cues. Neurotransmitters that, make us excited about food get diminished. Our ability to produce serotonin starts to dwindle away. And we know that serotonin and our mood are so heavily connected. So like, what does that mean in the larger scope of experiencing anxiety and depression and other adverse mental health effects related to this substance that is so normalized and put in our face and asked of us to use, when we could have maybe a better experience processing and parceling some of these deeper wounds out. So like we can enjoy a piece of chocolate because we want the chocolate, not necessarily because we're punishing ourselves for having it based on our experience with taking a GLP-1.
And I think that's such an important point. It's like, what are we sacrificing in the long term? I saw a study that said that that a very large number, I think it was like 70% of people that start them go off of them within a year. One of the reasons cited was something that you just brought up, that life is kind of miserable when your desire is shut down, when your serotonin is not available to you, that things get really boring, things are not very exciting anymore, and you can get depressed on these medications. So that is one of the reasons that was cited why people go off of them. Also, there can be very serious side effects, the gut, thyroid cancers and things like that. So also side effects would be another reason people go off of them. But I have thought about that, like the weight loss that anybody would be able to have with one of these medications is limited. Right. There's a certain percentage that of weight that people can lose. And then at that point, one has to stay on the medication if they are to maintain that weight loss. So then you've got to stay on that medication forever in order to maintain that weight loss, because as soon as you go off of it, you regain. But the other thing I really worry about is what's happening while you're on it, because we know, and we all know from experience, all the many times that we maybe gone on a crash diet, restricted our food or whatever, you're not getting enough nutrition. Your metabolism suppresses itself. The brain is really too smart to allow you to starve or to get malnourished. So it's going to fight back. And one of the ways that it fights back is by suppressing your metabolism so that you store more of what you eat. So how long can a person really be on one of these medications, not eating enough, without having that metabolic change that could cause them then to start storing more of what they eat so that they can eat less to maintain that weight loss? We saw, did you guys ever see the study that was done on the Biggest Loser contestants who lost all that weight on TV? You saw that, Sydney?
I did.
Do you guys remember what we learned from that study?
If I'm remembering correctly, it's that it's not super easy to maintain and kind of launches you into malnourishment. But then also most of the people end up gaining the weight back because eating that little of food is not sustainable.
Yeah. The main thing that they studied, so that the Biggest Loser contestants lost all this weight in the show, a huge amount of weight. And a lot of people would say they did it the healthy way by eating a certain way and exercising a lot. I take issue with that, but that's an issue for another day. But a lot of people would say that they did it a healthy way. So 7 years later, a study was done, and they found that all of the contestants from that season, but one, had regained the weight plus more. But their biggest thing was that their metabolisms had suppressed and had not recovered from that suppression. So in order to maintain a higher weight than they had when they actually started, they could eat 300 to 400, 500 calories less per day to maintain a higher weight. So one of the things that tells us is that the more that we put our bodies through these yo-yo dieting cycles where we're starving to lose weight and we're suppressing the appetite, the more likely it is that the metabolism doesn't come back from that. And when we're working with clients with eating disorders, a lot of times we're collaborating with a dietitian to try to help the person recover a healthy metabolism, start feeding themselves and training their brain to know that they're not going to ever be starved again, that the food environment is safe and it is generous, and we're going to be able to eat consistently and get the nourishment that we need. And that's what brings our metabolism back. We can't keep going through these yo-yo dieting cycles and not have a weight gain impact. And that's what I worry about for people in the long term with Ozempic. Is the weight going to come back plus more?
And that's the hard thing. I think we don't know. We don't have enough information yet because these drugs are still fairly new, and them being used in this capacity is new, and we don't have a lot of long-term data at what are the long-term impacts.
Yeah, we don't have enough data what are the long-term impacts, but we do know about how the body responds to not having enough food. I mean, some of the people that I know that are on these medications, I have a lot of friends that are on them, and I'll see them I was on a trip with someone who was on it. She'd have a little tiny taco for lunch and then save the other tiny taco for dinner, and then she'd have it for dinner. She'd pick at a salad or something, and I know it felt really good to her, and I'm sensitive to how much relief she's getting at this time from not having a lot of hunger. But I'm so worried about her because I know that's not enough food, and I know that her body is having a response to that, and that doesn't last forever that way. I also wish she had more of the opportunity to kind of just make friends with her hunger and sort it out in the ways that we have.
It makes me think about the relational component, right? Because we talk about Ozempic from a biological standpoint, but there's also this relationship component to using Ozempic and like how does our culture think and relate to food as being like security or as using food to be like inviting, going out to dinner with your friends, having dinner parties, what is the sacrifice of someone using Ozempic mean for family relationships, friendship, all those things where like hanging out with your friends, going to dinner, drinking a glass of wine, what have you, is your way of connecting. And if you take that away, what does that mean for those friendships, family relationships in the long run too?
I think that's a great point. I mean, I remember when I was in my eating disorder, not avoiding social eating, and which was terrible because I was very isolated and alone. And I didn't want to go deal with food with people. I didn't want people to see me eat. I didn't want to have all of the conflict around people. I wanted to do the secret stuff I was doing without anybody seeing. It's an extremely isolating aspect of my eating disorder. And it's a really good question, Lindsay, how people are, who are using Ozempic how it might be impacting their social eating.
Yeah. And I know I, at certain points during my eating disorder, was more than willing to use behaviors in front of people and was perfectly fine going out to dinner with a group of my friends and them all ordering their entrees, ordering their drinks, like sitting and having a really good time. And I just sat there with like my cup of water and just was like there to socialize because I didn't want to be left out. And then as I've like gotten a little better and had conversations with these people, they were like, dude, you weren't fun to be around. Like that was weird. That was like very uncomfortable for all of us to like sit and have a good time and you just be like sitting there refusing to eat. Like we don't want to spend time with you when you're like that. People notice things like that, I think when you're in it, it's really easy to feel like that is normal and like that is your reality. It's not always the most fun to be in relationship with people that are actively undernourishing themselves.
Yeah. I wonder what our audience thinks about that. And if anybody anybody wants to weigh in, anybody using Ozempic, and how is it affecting your social life and your friendships and your, ability to connect around food. And it's sad what you're talking about, of course, because you talked about that period in your life with your eating disorder in our last podcast. And that's very isolating. That it was a time when you needed those connections more than ever, and people don't really have fun eating with you.
Yeah.
So when we were talking about how in the last podcast, how our eating disorder started, one of the things that got brought up a lot is the going on a diet kind of like just this once, like it's just for this, like I'm just going to lose a little weight. I'm just going to, lose a little weight for this particular event or something like that. And I think about how many people might possibly be getting GLP-1s to just lose a little weight, and wondering if that's going to be the gateway drug for a lot of people that get us into that extreme disordered eating behavior that all of us experienced from our just this once, just a little bit, just a few pounds kind of mentality. What do you guys think?
I feel like I have a lot to say about this because it's true. Noticing the effects or the impact that just doing it one time has, you get a dopamine rush, you get excitement, you get a part of this cycle where it's like, oh, I wonder if I do it again and again and again, what is that going to look like? How am I going to feel? Because I feel so good doing it the first time. Was it going to look like 5 times from now? And I think that's a very, very dangerous and slippery slope, especially as we're coming up in holiday time where we have a ton of events, parties, dinners, gatherings where we want to dress up and look good and look hot. And what is one time going to turn into when there's so much reinforcement and chemical reinforcement with dopamine firing up in the brain?
And societal reinforcement.
Yeah. Instant gratification is a scary thing because when you get that kind of response that you're looking for, it programs your brain to make an association. And it's like, well, if that worked this time, what's to say that it won't work again? But we all know that the more and the more and the more you use a behavior, the higher the likelihood that it's going to like turn into a full-blown habit. I think all 3 of us had that experience where I know I was very open about it. Like I had no intention to entirely stop eating every food under the sun when I started my diet when I was 12. That was not my intention at all, but I found that like I was getting positive feedback from my friends and family. I was getting the emotional relief I was looking for. I was way more comfortable in my body. And I didn't want that to stop. It was giving it at the time, I thought it was giving me the results I was looking for.
Yeah. And the ego gets so attached, right?
Mhm.
Because we need to belong. And if we're struggling and if we're having a difficult time in the social sphere, we're going to be even more vulnerable to trying to project an identity that we think is going to get more of that positive reinforcement, right? And then once the ego gets it just a little bit, the ego's like, oh, let's do that again. That felt good. And let's do that again. Let's do that again. And pretty soon, we were talking about this last time, when you start off your eating disorder, it's like making a deal with the devil. You don't realize that, oh, just a little more weight, just a little more weight. You're feeling so in control as you're losing weight or as you're restricting your food in the beginning. And then your eating disorder just takes control of you. And you go down this rabbit hole where there's just constant rumination and constant stress and constant weighing and constant wondering of, did I gain it back? Did I look okay? We get preoccupied, and it can take over our lives.
And I think the larger conversation where we fall as a society is we talk about like the benefits, but we don't talk about the drawbacks of this. You see doctors like encouraging and prescribing diet pills to teenagers, for example, working with a client who experience that. And you see it advertised in the media where like your favorite celebrities are like glamorizing this lifestyle, right? But we're not talking about the things that we're talking about now, which is all the negative drawbacks that essentially we're going to experience if we continue going down this.
It's not about the weight itself and the number that you're sitting at or using the GLP-1 to like help you lose the weight to feel better. It's like, how can we help you foster the confidence and have a healthy relationship with food and like feel secure in yourself where you're at right now? Because there's probably nothing wrong with where you're at right now in the first place.
Very well said. Could not agree more. And I think that might be one of the opportunities that these medications will cut off for people, is being able to just learn how to accept and love your body for what it is. Be in your body, realize that it's this amazing thing, and get comfortable with who you are, who you're supposed to be. That's one of the things that gets cut off. It's that. And then also it gets kind of cut off the opportunity to actually make friends with your hunger and learn how to read your hunger signals and learn how to piece out what's emotional and what's physical hunger and what is my body saying and how do I better take care of it? All of these things are just like, we're kind of cut off from that opportunity to have peace with our bodies and peace with food in the long term. So, Sydney, what would you say to somebody in the audience who maybe has an eating disorder history? They go in to see their doctor and the doctor is willing to prescribe or wants to prescribe a GLP-1, a weight loss medication to them?
I think my first thing I would like to say to someone is, does taking that weight loss medication align with your values and your goals for yourself? Is that something that feels good to you? And is that how you want your relationship with food, your body, your health to be? And I think the second thing that I would say is like, you're allowed to stand up for yourself. You are allowed to advocate for what feels good to you. And you're allowed to disagree and say, no, that's actually not what I'm wanting to do. I want to explore other options. We know ourselves better than a medical provider is going to sometimes. And I think it can be really challenging to advocate for yourself in a medical setting, especially when something being suggested to you is something that society and diet culture absolutely glorifies. But at the end of the day, health does not look one certain way and is not dictated by a singular drug. And I would really encourage everyone to reflect on like, what does health mean to me and how can I align with that version of it for myself?
And for anyone prescribing, I would just say, ask about the person's relationship with food, with their bodies, if they've had any sort of eating disorder history, any sort of mental health history that might, be of concern before prescribing a medication like this, because there are lots of ways that we can help people get healthier that don't involve medication. So many ways. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, a referral to a dietitian that's aware of eating disorders or a therapist or something like that to start working on the relationship with food and body is a is a safer way for somebody with a history like that to work through whatever the struggle is with food or food noise or the perceived struggle with weight or any of those things. So for our audience, we'd love to hear any feedback that you might have. Are you relating to anything that we're talking about? Do you have questions? Do you disagree? We'd really appreciate any comments that you have. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you so much for being here.